Some Hollywood marriages fade quietly. Others explode across headlines and never really leave the public imagination. Bob Thornton and Angelina Jolie's marriage was the second kind. 3 years of tabloid frenzy, blood-vial rumors, and a wedding so sudden it blindsided the woman. Thornton had been engaged to just weeks earlier. For nearly 2 decades, fans were left to speculate about what actually broke them apart. Was it the age gap? The fame? Some private betrayal the press never uncovered? It took years, but Thornton eventually answered the question himself. Calmly, warmly, and without a trace of bitterness. And the real reason turned out to be far simpler and far more human than anyone expected. By the time Bob Thornton met Angelina Jolie in 1999, he wasn't a young man testing the waters of love for the first time. He was 44 years old and already on his 4th divorce, having been married to Melissa Lee Gatlin, Tony Lawrence, Cinda Williams, and Pietra Dawn Cherniak. Each marriage had ended within a few years, and by his own account, none of them had given him the stability he seemed to be searching for. He'd built a career in fits and starts, writing, acting, and hustling through Hollywood's margins before breaking through with Sling Blade in 1996, a film he wrote, directed, and starred in, and one that finally gave him real creative standing in the industry. That film alone reshaped how Hollywood saw him, earning him an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay and proving that the years of scraping by on small roles and unsold scripts had been leading somewhere. Professionally, things were finally clicking. Personally, he carried the weight of a man who had cycled through relationships without ever quite landing. Even decades later, he's spoken candidly enough about that stretch of his life to make clear it wasn't easy to look back on. For marriages by his mid-40s is not a resume most people would want printed in a magazine profile, and he's never pretended otherwise. What's notable is that he never tried to rewrite that history either. He simply kept moving forward, the way people do when the alternative is dwelling on things they can't change. At the time he met Jolie on the set of the 1999 dark comedy, Pushing 10, he was engaged to actress Laura Dern. Jolie, meanwhile, was 24, 9 years into an acting career that was about to catapult her into a different stratosphere of fame entirely, with an Academy Award for Girl, Interrupted, arriving that same year. She'd already built a reputation as one of the more unpredictable and fearless young actresses working in Hollywood, someone who didn't seem interested in playing it safe, either on screen or off. The two of them, on paper, looked like an unlikely pairing. A 20-year age gap, 2 very different career trajectories, and Thornton's history of short, difficult marriages hardly suggested a formula for lasting love. But whatever chemistry formed between them on that set moved fast enough to upend both of their existing relationships within a matter of months. What happened between Thornton and Jolie on that film set became one of the more startling turns in celebrity history. The two developed a fast, intense connection while Dern was away working. Rather than easing out of his engagement in any conventional way, Thornton and Jolie eloped in Las Vegas in May 2000, a decision so abrupt that Dern has said she learned about the marriage the same way the rest of the world did, through the news. The union stunned Hollywood, and it also handed the tabloid press an inexhaustible storyline. Thornton and Jolie were rarely seen apart in public and made no effort to downplay how intense their connection was. That openness fed years of coverage, some of it accurate, much of it inflated into something closer to spectacle. The most famous example involved the vials of blood the couple was rumored to wear around their necks, a detail that became shorthand in the press for just how extreme their relationship supposedly was. Thornton has spent years quietly correcting that particular story. In more recent interviews, including one with Rolling Stone's Andy Green, he explained that what they actually wore were small lockets, each containing a single drop of blood, a private, almost old-fashioned romantic gesture rather than anything theatrical. He described it as a romantic little idea and nothing more, joking that by the time the story made its way through the press cycle, it sounded like the two of them were walking around wearing buckets of blood. It's a detail he's returned to more than once over the years, almost as if he knows it's the single image people most associate with the marriage, and he'd like the record set straight before too much more time passes. In an earlier conversation on the HFPA in Conversation podcast, he made a similar point about the broader coverage of their marriage, saying much of what was written about them at the time was exaggerated and that reality wasn't nearly as chaotic as the headlines suggested. That's a theme that runs through nearly every interview he's given about this chapter of his life. The sense that the version of the marriage the public consumed in real time was never quite the version he and Jolie actually lived. Tabloids in the early 2000s had every incentive to lean into the strangest possible interpretation of any detail. A locket became a vial, a private joke became a headline about crazy behavior, and a young couple's affection became evidence of instability. Thornton has generally taken the exaggeration in stride rather than with resentment, treating it more as an amusing footnote than a wound that still stings. Their wedding didn't slow the media's fascination. If anything, it intensified it. The two were constantly photographed, constantly quoted, constantly analyzed. To outside observers, it looked like a relationship built entirely for the cameras. But behind that image, two very different people were trying to build an actual life together, and the pressures of fame were landing on them in very different ways. Jolie's career and public profile were expanding rapidly. She'd already won an Oscar, and by 2001 she'd been named a Goodwill Ambassador for the UN Refugee Agency, a role that sent her to conflict zones and refugee camps around the world. Her life was becoming international, humanitarian, and increasingly public in ways that went well beyond acting. Thornton, by contrast, has been open about the fact that large-scale public life never sat comfortably with him. He's described himself in interviews as someone with agoraphobic tendencies, someone who is more at home in small, familiar spaces than in crowds or global spotlights. Where Jolie seemed to draw energy from an expanding, outward-facing life, Thornton has said he needed the opposite: quiet, routine, and a much smaller world. It's worth sitting with how strange that mismatch must have felt in practice. This wasn't a couple slowly drifting apart over irreconcilable values or a slow-building resentment. It was two people who, from the very start, were simply wired to want different-sized lives. One partner's career was actively pulling her toward refugee camps, film sets on other continents, and a public role as a humanitarian voice. The other partner's comfort zone was shrinking by the year, not because of anything Jolie did, but because that was simply who he'd always been. Even his own joke about disappearing into the sunset marquee after each divorce hints at a pattern that predates Jolie entirely, a lifelong instinct to retreat rather than perform. One of the clearest turning points in the marriage came in March 2002, when Jolie began the process of adopting a son, Maddox, from Cambodia. Thornton was present for parts of that process, but it later became public that Jolie ultimately completed the adoption as a single parent, a detail that, in hindsight, said a lot about where the two of them were emotionally by that point. Within months of the adoption being finalized, Jolie and Thornton had separated. Their divorce was finalized in 2003, just 3 years after their Las Vegas wedding. At the time, the split was framed by tabloids as sudden and mysterious, fitting neatly into the same sensationalized narrative that had followed the couple from the start. For years, Thornton mostly avoided detailed public comment on it, occasionally joking that after each of his divorces he'd hide out at the Sunset Marquis Hotel rather than explaining what had actually gone wrong. Looking back, the adoption timeline lines up almost perfectly with the marriage's final months, and it's not hard to see why. Motherhood gave Jolie a new center of gravity, one that only accelerated her pull toward a more global, public-facing existence. Within a few years of the divorce, she would go on to work extensively with the UN Refugee Agency, travel repeatedly into conflict zones, and gradually become one of the most visible humanitarian figures to come out of Hollywood. None of that happened overnight, but the seeds of it were clearly present in 2002, right as the marriage was quietly coming apart. For Thornton, that same period marked less of a beginning and more of a retreat, a return to the smaller, steadier world he's always said suited him best. It wasn't until 2018, on the HFPA in Conversation podcast, that Thornton addressed the breakup directly and specifically. Looking back on the marriage, he didn't describe any single dramatic incident, betrayal, or fight. Instead, he pointed to something much quieter and, in a way, much sadder. Two people whose paths in life had simply started pulling in opposite directions. "We just had different lifestyles," he said. "Hers is a global lifestyle, and mine is an agoraphobic lifestyle. He added that it was probably the only real reason the marriage hadn't lasted. Not scandal, not incompatibility of feeling, just two very different ways of moving through the world that eventually couldn't be reconciled. He's repeated some version of that explanation in later interviews as well, including his 2025 conversation with Rolling Stone, where he described the relationship as one of the greatest times of his life and called their eventual split a really civilized breakup, attributing it once again to how differently the two of them were built to live. It's a strikingly unglamorous explanation for a marriage that had been covered like a soap opera for years. There was no villain in Thornton's telling, no accusations, no resentment. Just an honest account of a woman whose calling was pulling her toward the world stage, and a man who had spent his whole life more comfortable retreating from it. What's notable about Thornton's more recent comments is how consistently warm they've been. He hasn't used these interviews to settle scores or rewrite the marriage as a mistake. Quite the opposite. He's repeatedly described the time as genuinely great and has spoken about Jolie with real affection, calling her a wonderful person and praising the way she's continued to make films and pursue projects that matter to her regardless of whether they succeed commercially. He's also used these later interviews to gently push back on the version of the marriage that tabloids sold to the public for years. Beyond debunking the blood vial exaggeration, he's made a broader point that a lot of what got written about the two of them during their marriage simply wasn't true to how things actually were day to day. In his telling, the public spectacle and the private relationship were two very different things, the first shaped by a press cycle hungry for drama, the second shaped by two people who, for a few years, genuinely cared about each other before realizing they wanted different things out of life. After the divorce was finalized, Thornton's life took a noticeably quieter turn. He leaned further into music, performing with his band The Boxmasters, and continued acting in projects that let him work without the intensity of the spotlight that had followed his marriage to Jolie. His acting career didn't slow down. He continued taking on notable film and television roles over the following 2 decades, but the tabloid attention that had defined his public image during the Jolie years largely faded, and by most accounts, that suited him just fine. In more recent years, he's found a new wave of visibility through the series Landman on Paramount+, reuniting on screen with longtime friend Demi Moore, whose friendship with Thornton actually predates his marriage to Jolie by decades. Not long after the split, he began a relationship with Connie England, who worked behind the scenes in the film industry rather than in front of the camera. The two were together for years before marrying in 2014, and they have a daughter, Bella. By most accounts, that relationship has given Thornton the kind of steady, low-key life he said he was always better suited to. He's described England, in his own words, as being on his speed, a phrase that says a lot when set against the pace of his marriage to Jolie. It's the kind of comment that only makes sense once you understand what he said about needing a smaller, quieter world. After decades of intensity, unpredictability, and very public relationships, he finally found someone whose rhythm matched his own. Jolie's path went in almost the opposite direction. Her humanitarian work expanded significantly in the years following the divorce. Her family grew to include 6 children, and she moved into directing major films in addition to acting in them. Her life became even more international, more public, and more demanding of exactly the kind of visibility Thornton has said he was never built for. Looking at where each of them ended up, it's hard not to see Thornton's different lifestyles explanation as almost obviously correct in hindsight. These weren't two people who fell out of love in any conventional sense. They were two people whose lives, by their very nature, required almost opposite things. One thriving on constant motion and global engagement, the other needing to shrink his world down to something manageable and quiet. Part of what makes Thornton's explanation land now is how different it is from the noise that surrounded the marriage in real time. In the early 2000s, tabloid coverage of Thornton and Jolie leaned almost entirely into shock value. The blood necklaces, the age gap, the intensity of their public affection. None of that coverage had much room for a nuanced answer like, "We simply wanted different things out of life." That kind of explanation doesn't sell magazines. A scandal does. It's also worth remembering that Thornton, by his own description, isn't someone who's ever been eager to explain himself to the public. His retreat into quiet, private life after each of his marriages wasn't just a joke about hotel rooms. It reflected an actual discomfort with public scrutiny that, ironically, is part of the very same, different lifestyle he later cited as the reason things ended with Jolie. It took years of distance and a fair amount of comfort in his current life with England before he was willing to talk about the marriage candidly rather than deflecting with humor. For 20 years, the public built its own theories about why Bob Thornton and Angelina Jolie's marriage collapsed so quickly after such an intense beginning. Some pointed to the age gap. Others assumed there had to be some deeper betrayal hiding behind the tabloid noise. The real answer, once Thornton finally gave it, turned out to be almost anticlimactic in its honesty. Two people who loved each other, married impulsively, and then discovered that the lives they were each meant to live simply couldn't run alongside each other. There was no scandal at the center of it, no villain, no secret grievance saved up for 2 decades. Just a global, restless, world-facing life on one side, and a quiet, private, more guarded one on the other. And two people who, by all accounts, still speak fondly of the time they spent trying to make those two lives fit together. Maybe that's the part of this story that resonates most, even all these years later. It's easy for the public to assume that when a high-profile marriage ends quickly, something must have gone wrong in a dramatic, headline-worthy way. But Thornton's account suggests something far more relatable. Two people who genuinely loved each other, who weren't lying about the connection they felt, and who still ran into the simple, unglamorous problem of wanting different lives. It's a story that plays out in relationships far from Hollywood every single day, just usually without cameras, magazine covers, or 20 years of public speculation attached to it. What made the Thornton-Jolie marriage different wasn't the reason it ended. It was the size of the stage it ended on. What do you think? Could Bob Thornton and Angelina Jolie's marriage have lasted if they'd crossed paths at a different point in their lives? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one.